Welcome to What is Going On for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on OMTimes flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. If there's one gift that's emerging from the toll the last 2 years have taken on us, it's a growing understanding of how unbalanced modern-day living has become, the way we've constructed our society, the value we put on doing rather than being, making more money, chasing success, acquiring more possessions, racing to get where we feel we must be by the time we retire so that we can then do our being in the security of greater luxury and comfort. We see the distortion reflected in the soaring rates of stress, anxiety, depression, uncertainty and suicide, which were rising dangerously even before the emergence of COVID and will remain a danger to our health and well-being long after COVID becomes part of our history. Today's guest is a pioneering researcher who knows a lot about chronic stress, anxiety and trauma, and she's used her personal and professional experience of it to create an effective solution to training your brain and body to thrive during stress and recover from trauma. Elizabeth Stanley, PhD, is a professor of security studies at Georgetown University, an award-winning author and a US Army veteran with service in Asia and Europe who holds degrees from Yale, Harvard and MIT. Elizabeth Stanley joins me now to talk about her book, Widen the Window, which gives us a new understanding of stress and trauma, as well as the tools to heal and thrive. Dr. Elizabeth Stanley, welcome.
Thank you, Sandie, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Elizabeth, you have said that you were born to write this book. Tell us why.
I think sometimes authors end up working on the things that they personally need to know, and that was certainly the case for me with this topic. The more I learned about stress and trauma and resilience, the more I realized my own life was Exhibit A for what I write about. I experienced a lot of stress and trauma, starting in childhood with childhood adversity, sexual violence, then during my time in the military with stressful military training and 2 deployments. I had a near-death experience while I was a peacekeeper in Bosnia. And through all of that, over many decades, I coped with this stress and trauma of these experiences the way many of us have been socialized to cope, which is to say, I pushed it under, I pushed it aside, I suppressed it, I compartmentalized, and I powered through. But as is often the case for those of us who experience a lot of chronic stress and trauma, it came out sideways in my body. My body really bore the burden of this denial, and I had a lot of respiratory illnesses and insomnia and migraines, and I thought those were all physical things. They were, but they were the result of all of this imbalance and the ways that my body and mind had become dysregulated. And eventually, what got my attention was losing my eyesight for a period of time. I had Lyme disease, but didn't know it, and it had attacked my optic nerves. And that was the beginning of finally saying, okay, I've got to do this differently. And that embarked me on about a 20-year journey for healing myself and then doing some clinical training, intensive mindfulness practice here in Burma, and then developing a resilience program and testing it with high-stress groups.
There was one point where you actually lost your sight.
Yes, I did. It was right after I had started on the tenure track at Georgetown, where I teach, and I needed to take a medical leave of absence. And I used that medical leave of absence to sit my first 3-month silent retreat, which was the beginning to get acquainted with my mind and body and all of these many experiences that I had shoved out of conscious awareness, but that were actively working in the background. driving what was going on in my body and driving my unconscious responses to almost everything in my life.
Well, it's becoming more and more evident, isn't it, that our body stores it all. Every emotion, every piece of trauma that we experience, it doesn't go away, it stays there. And it does have its effect in different ways. Only today I was talking to somebody about, all of the evidence of stress creating things like allergies in the body, food allergies, allergies to all kinds of things that people have never been allergic before. And we don't think about things like that. We just think, I've got an allergy or I've got this recurring pain. We never think to tie it into the stress that we've been experiencing. At the same time, that pain, started happening to us. Why is it that we're always... our attitude to stress is so wrong, isn't it? We actually say it with pride. Oh, I'm so stressed. I'm so busy. We don't think about the harm we're doing.
Yes, we've completely romanticized stress, and so many of our organizations and institutions, our schools and our workplaces, really treat being overscheduled and super busy and not getting enough sleep and coming to work with a cold, as the walking wounded. We treat all of those things as somehow signs that we're important and successful. And we lose sight of the fact that they are really imbalanced and that we are missing out on important messages that our minds and bodies are trying to convey to us to balance it out. And I think that helps to drive some of those many bigger imbalances you talked about at the beginning of the show, the high rates of suicide that have been really taking off since the 90s, high rates of addiction and drug overdoses, high rates of domestic violence, and reliance on all kinds of behaviors that either help fuel that high, the adrenaline-seeking behaviors, or violent behaviors, either self-harming to ourselves or harming of others.
Well, let's talk about stress and trauma before we get into what you've done, what you've developed, which is proving remarkably effective as a way of learning to manage this and retraining our body and brain. Stress and trauma, they're two different things, yes?
They are two things on a continuum. And I think many of us have been socialized to think of them as separate, and many of the researchers who work in these fields consider them separate, but they are a neurobiological continuum. Stress arousal happens whenever there is a stressor, an event, either inside of us, like racing thoughts or a cold, or outside of us, like a pandemic or conflict or even bad weather or bills. A stressor plus our brain's perceiving of it as threatening or challenging. Those two things together will lead us to have stress arousal activation in the mind and body. And if all of those things are present and our brain is also perceiving us to be helpless, powerless, or lacking control, then the arousal is high enough that it moves into the zone of trauma. But it is a continuum. And the fact that it's a continuum is really important to keep in mind when we go to try and heal from it. Where we fall on that continuum is really determined by the width of our window of tolerance to stress. People who have wide windows are much less likely to perceive themselves unconsciously as helpless, powerless, and lacking control, so they're much less likely to experience trauma. And that was a major point a principle that I built my resilience training on, helping us to be able to access a sense of choice in any situation. That's protective from experiencing trauma.
So tell me about the window. I mean, you've said that we have a window of tolerance to stress arousal that we've wired throughout our lives. Are you saying that some of us, even those that have had a lot of trauma, in their childhood, like you did, might have a capacity to handle more trauma and more stress than others?
We do have a different window. Each of us uniquely have our individual window, and you're right, it is wired throughout our life. When we are not paying attention to our window, it tends to narrow. And in the book, I lay out 3 pathways by which it narrows. Childhood stress and adversity is a big one, and for many of us, we're not even aware how our childhood may have affected our window. Shock trauma events is the second way we can narrow it. This is those big capital T traumatic events that kind of overwhelm our threshold. And that's the thing most people will consider traumatic. It's kind of conventional understanding of that. And then the third way that we narrow our window, and everyone is doing this if they're not paying attention to it, is when we're experiencing chronic stress arousal in our life every day, like from chronic sleep deprivation or dealing with sexism or racism in our workplace or at school, or dealing with habits that actually feel soothing but that aren't helping us recover. So our window can get narrowed. Everybody's window can. For those of us who've experienced a lot of stress, if we take some steps to counteract that and help our minds and bodies to truly recover from those prior stressful experiences, that can actually widen our window. So in some ways, it's like the silver lining to a very black cloud. For those of us who experienced a lot of stress and trauma, with adequate recovery, we can end up with some of the widest windows of all. But it's important that we support our minds and bodies with the recovery needed for widening our window. And yet most of us haven't been taught how to do that. And as a result, in most of our society, people's windows get narrower and narrower without taking the actions necessary to widen it. When we're inside our window, we have access to all of our thinking brain functions, the ones that we need to make good decisions, to connect with others during stress. And then we also have the ability to downregulate and recover. When we're outside our window, many of those functions go offline, or they're operating in a very degraded way. That's when we have us versus them thinking, or we might get very anxious or be distracted and unable to concentrate or make decisions that are very biased. And unfortunately, when you look around the world today, so many people are operating in this narrowed windowed state, and then they're making decisions that can actually be exacerbating stress into the future.
I think one of the biggest things that, people have a problem, all of us have a problem dealing with, is uncertainty. And the last 2 years, nothing has been certain. And everything that we think is certain one day isn't the next. So it's like everybody has had a massive dose of this, dumped on top of them. And people are getting very frustrated. And I've noticed that frustration is one of those things too that really sends people over the edge when they feel their back is against the wall and they've got no way of controlling something. That's when they're most likely to get really stressed.
Absolutely, because in that state, they are feeling helpless, powerless, and lacking control, those 3 defining characteristics of trauma. So someone might be experiencing the trauma as the emotion of frustration, and they can tell you, I'm frustrated, but they won't really recognize that in the same moment, they're actually also traumatized. It's the trauma in that moment that's unseen, but that's driving their sense of helplessness and powerlessness. And that, when someone's in that stage, it's very possible for them to then lash out and act out in ways that might actually be making things worse.
Yeah. You also talk about emotion contagion. Tell me about that.
Yes. So we are wired as humans in a social way. We're wired to connect to other people. And it makes sense that we would be wired like this when you think about a human infant just born. they can't. They're completely dependent on others. They have to be. There's no way that they can take care of themselves. We are the species of all the species that takes the longest to reach maturity. So we need to be able to connect with and rely on others. And as a result, we've wired a variety of different neurobiological mechanisms to connect us in this way. And one of the potential downsides of our interconnected wiring happens when we are stressed, because stress and emotions are very contagious. They're most contagious in two kinds of relationships, either relationships with attachment bonds, so like between a parent and their children or between romantic partners, and then also in relationships that have power differences, like between a teacher and his students, or a doctor and her patient, or a boss and their subordinates, and of course from leaders to followers. And when we are outside our window, when our window has gotten narrowed and we're feeling some stress, that's when other people's emotions and stress arousal is most contagious to us. When we're inside our window, we actually have turned on the hormone oxytocin, which is the social bonding hormone, mm-hmm. and that hormone protects us from picking up the stress and emotion contagion from others. It's one of the reasons why many neuroscientists talk about oxytocin as the nursing hormone, not just because it's produced when a mother is nursing, like breastfeeding her baby, but it's also a hormone that nurses in hospitals or clinics rely on to be able to approach someone else who's in distress and help them even without picking up their stress and emotion contagion. But the problem is everyone's windows are so narrowed right now, even nurses, that when our window is narrowed, we're not producing oxytocin as much, and then we are vulnerable to picking up on stress and emotion contagion from others. It's fueling the this huge pandemic of burnout that we're seeing and compassion fatigue that we're seeing around the planet right now.
Yeah. I mean, we hear these stories about people losing their tempers on planes, especially, I mean, there you are in a little environment, you can't get out of the plane, and any little thing, if you're already triggered, is going to, erupt into something even bigger. People are much angrier these days.
Yes. They're both, I think, we can debate whether they're actually angrier or whether they just no longer have the capacity to regulate anger that they might have been feeling before. But the old ways of coping that many of us had relied on for decades, this sort of sucking it up, powering through, compartmentalizing, pushing it under, the narrower your window gets, the more that kind of compartmentalization doesn't work. So if someone had been sitting on a lot of unresolved emotions for a long time, those kind of attempts to kind of push it under, it's not going to work so much anymore, and that's when it starts erupting. And as a result, it seems like everybody is angrier or more anxious than they were before. And that's just because those old coping mechanisms, they only work to a certain point, but our system needs recovery, and that's the piece that's been missing.
Yeah, and you've said that, a lot of those strategies that we use, they actually can exacerbate it.
Yes, they can. They can because as we are either acting the emotion out, which can fuel it further, or we are trying to self-medicate it in some way, with alcohol or comfort food eating or self-harming behaviors, cutting or disordered eating or adrenaline-seeking behaviors like riding a motorcycle at 120 miles an hour. Those things might be soothing in the immediate term for our survival brain, but they're not actually giving us recovery. And because our thinking brain functions are degraded when we have a narrowed window, and one of the thinking brain functions that's most important in this regard is willpower, we then give in to these behaviors, and then, we feel badly that we did that, then we're guilty and we're ashamed, and that then can just fuel the cycle further. So each time around, we're adding to our stress load, and we are undermining our inner capacity to cope. And then that shapes our choices for the next time around. And it just continues to this growing stress load that individually we're carrying and collectively as a society we are carrying.
Yeah. Now, you said that Widen the Window grew from your own healing journey and from teaching the resilience program that you created, which is called Mindfulness-Based Mind Fitness Training, MFIT, I think, for short. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So, how did this emerge, this program? I mean, was it sort of like a eureka moment, or was it something that, emerged over a number of years out of the work that you were doing on yourself?
I did have a eureka moment dream where I saw myself doing something like this, but then it took actually several years for it to emerge as a program. During which time I was also doing some clinical training and realized pieces that needed to get integrated into it. And after the first pilot study with a group of Marines, U.S. Marines that were preparing to deploy to Iraq, and seeing their response to some of the initial exercises in the pilot study, that helped me realize I needed to put the program together in a different way. So yes, it was over probably a 3-year period that the program came together in the form that it is in now. And I partnered with 2 different sets of neuroscientists to test the efficacy of the program with troops preparing to both deploy to Iraq and to Afghanistan. And in both cases, over time, our research really showed that training the attention to be able to regulate stress arousal in the mind and body to help the survival brain to recover, to help the autonomic nervous system to recover, that it was possible by where we're directing our attention to help the system recover and widen our window. And in published research over a decade, several different scientific publications have shown that we can, through where we're directing our attention, improve our cognitive performance, regulate our emotions better, regulate our physiology so that we can get stress arousal much more efficient. So we can get aroused to a high peak when we need it in a very stressful situation, but then have a faster and more complete recovery afterwards. And we also showed changes in sleep quality and sleep duration and changes in immune functioning. So all of these different things were the result of training attention and using that paired with an understanding of how the mind and body go through stress, so that the attention was being trained in a way that could help support the natural recovery process our body already knows how to do, but that most of us have spent much of our lives blocking from happening.
Now, it's been published in top-tier science journals. You've taught this to thousands of people in high-stress environments, including corporate leaders, first responders, healthcare workers, military service members, and members of Congress. And you've been featured on 60 Minutes, ABC Evening News, NPR, Time Magazine, lots of media outlets. It sounds like, you had this idea and then, you met these neuroscientists and you did some research and some testing. It couldn't have been that easy. How did you manage to get everybody on board, especially the military?
That's a great question, Sandie. I think, the first couple times we did it before we had all of the published research was harder because people have preconceived notions and biases. And I won't lie, the first pilot group study we did, there was a lot of resistance among some of those Marines. What was interesting when I look back on that first group and when we look back on the data from that first group that showed really statistically significant and beneficial effects, that then we could leverage to get more research grant money and do further studies and then get even better results after. When I look back at that first group, the ones who were most willing to give it a try, even if it went against all of their kind of biases that, this is just some touchy-feely thing and this is not going to work, The ones who were willing to try it were the ones who were actively suffering. They had been through multiple deployments before. They had watched their minds and bodies and their relationships deteriorate over, successive deployments. They had watched themselves become addicts of one kind or another. They were dealing with crippling chronic pain, racing thoughts, medications weren't working, and they were like, well, the worst is that nothing happens. And so they were willing to try it. And the data from that first group were so surprising because the ones who were willing to give it a try were the ones who were worst off at the beginning. And the ones who didn't give it a try were the ones who hadn't deployed yet. This was a reservist unit. Many of them had civilian jobs that weren't too stressful. And after 8 weeks of training and 8 weeks of very stressful pre-deployment training, separate from my training, but like the other military training they were doing, big sleep deprivation and constantly going and not getting any recovery normally, we did tests again, at that 8 week point. And it was amazing to see that the ones who had been so bad off 8 weeks prior and who had no attention capacity, had no working memory capacity, had, emotional symptoms that were really, really high, they now were doing really well. Their attention was better. Their working memory capacity was restored. They were reporting very low perceived stress levels. They were reporting better sleep. And the ones who had been better off, now 8 weeks later, after 8 weeks of stressful military pre-deployment training, they were worse off. And seeing that kind of cross, that the group that had been good had gone bad and vice versa, it gave all of them pause to realize, okay, this isn't just something touchy-feely, this really does work. And that really helped to create interest in doing more of it, not just with this group, but with other groups.
Very, very cool. Very cool. We're going to take a short break now, Elizabeth. You're listening to What is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest is pioneering researcher, award-winning author, and Professor of Security Studies at Georgetown University, Elizabeth A. Stanley, PhD. And we're discussing her latest book, Widen the Window, Training Your Brain and Body to Thrive During Stress and Recover from Trauma, which chronicles her own story of healing from intense lifelong trauma, which ultimately led to the development of an evidence-based approach to resilience called mindfulness-based mind fitness training. Still to come, more on Elizabeth's near-death experience in Bosnia, why MFIT works, and how it can help you and your loved ones recover from intense trauma and regain their lives. We'll be back in a few moments.
The future of internet radio is here. OMTimes Radio, IOM FM. Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
Vox Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Furman. Join me every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio for Vox Novus, the new voice.
Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Media's flagship radio show, What is Going On? And I have a question for you. Have you ever walked through a bookstore and known in your heart that you should have a book on one of those shelves, but don't know how to make it happen? Writing your story and getting your book into print may feel intimidating, but it's remarkably easy and satisfying when you have an experienced professional to guide you. So if you're still striving to connect with your muse, find your authentic voice, formulate your ideas, present your message in compelling prose, publish your book, and build your platform and profile, Just imagine what you could accomplish with 30 plus years of experience in writing, editing, publishing, judging, hosting, and resonance marketing to guide you. Maya Angelou once said that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. If you know you have a book in you, but don't know how to get it out of your head and into the hands of those who are waiting to read it, visit Sedgbeer.com, click on the Work With Me tab, and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be just what you've been looking for. That's Sedgbeer.com, Sedgbeer.com.
Coping-19, brought to you by CDC and the Ad Council.
If you're feeling increasingly lonely right now, you're not alone. It's totally normal. Even though we may not be able to get together in person, connecting virtually with friends and family still gives you a chance to interact with people and may help raise your spirits. Join a virtual book club, set up group text chats, or online video coffee breaks with coworkers.
Find more self-care and coping tips at coping-19.org.
Welcome back. Dr. Elizabeth Stanley, I'd like to go back to Bosnia and your near-death experience. That must have been a real defining moment in your life.
It was, in retrospect, quite a defining moment. In the moment it was happening, I was so traumatized, I don't think I really realized what a big deal it really was. And in the way that the military does things, within 3 days after being revived, I was back in my unit doing my job again. So it was kind of pushing through, compartmentalizing this many years later that I was able to really unpack what a big deal it was. But
are you willing to share any of that with us, what you experienced, what you remembered of that experience, and how it might have changed things for you?
Well, I had been in Bosnia at that point, not even 24 hours. I had been in charge of a convoy of 100 vehicles moving to Bosnia from Hungary, and there was a very bad storm and black ice, and the vehicles that I was responsible for, some of them had jackknifed. So we got stuck in Croatia for 3 days while the Croatian government tried to find a crane. I had pneumonia in both lungs, but didn't know it. I thought I was just fighting a bad cold, and we were sitting in our vehicles on the side of the road, 3 feet of snow, and very little heat. We couldn't waste our gas running our vehicles, so we had to sort of turn them on for half an hour and then be off for many hours. And my cold was getting worse, but it wasn't until we got into Bosnia and we were starting to clear space in this abandoned, burned out, bombed out bus depot, moving things to put tents in these buildings that had been bombed out, that the concrete dust on top of the pneumonia led me to stop breathing completely. And I had to be medevaced to the UN hospital by helicopter. And I don't remember most of what happened. Apparently, I threw the medical technician across the helicopter as I was trying to claw to breathe. But the next thing I really was aware of was being above my body and seeing a bright light and leaving my body, having kind of a classic near-death experience in that way. And I was ready to go. I was exhausted. I did not want to be there anymore. And a voice spoke with me and very kindly said, "You have to go back." And it was the kindest, most loving, most gentle voice I'd ever heard. And in the next moment, I'm now on the table looking up out of my eyes, and I had been resuscitated, paddled, and all these doctors above me, and just the pain, the physical pain of what had been happening rushed in my body. And I was in the UN hospital for 2.5 days and then released back to my unit. It stuck with me for quite some time, and it wasn't until many years later that I really understood that it hadn't been my time and that I was guided to come back. And I didn't realize in that moment that some of the worst of my dysregulation was still ahead of me, that this was not early January 1996, And it wasn't until 2004 that I lost my eyesight. So I had 8 very uncomfortable years still ahead of me before things sort of hit the worst. And then I started to really take off on my journey of recovery. But the feeling of that loving being guiding me was, it stayed, just like all of our traumas stay in our body, that love, that very unconditional love stayed with me too in my body. And it's actually there for all of us all the time. I just don't think many of us living in life day to day are aware of that unconditional love that's always there too.
Yeah. We spoke at the beginning about you thinking you were born to write this book, and do you now, from this vantage point, look back and think, this was all meant to be? No, I had the experiences I needed to have, and then I had the reminder or some kind of nudge from this near-death experience to do the work that I'm doing now.
Absolutely. I actually think that there is no creative endeavor of any kind, writing or art or anything that involves creating something that wasn't there before. I don't think that any creative endeavor is possible without some kind of co-creative partnership with the beyond. And I think that Widen the Window is the result of a co-creative partnership between this particular mind and body that is Liz Stanley and all the experiences that this mind and body had with the inspiration and insights and wisdom that come from the beyond. I know that sounds very odd, but...
No, not to me. And I'm sure not to many of our listeners either.
Yeah. So yes, this was the book that this mind and body was meant to write in partnership with the beyond.
Yeah. So back to MFIT. You talk about resilience a lot, and you say that resilience can be learned. How can we learn it? How does MFIT teach us to learn it?
It's a great question. There is still this cultural misconception that we are either resilient or we aren't, that it's this trait that we're born with and that some people have it and some people don't. And that's not true. Strictly speaking, I think we all have the capacity to be resilient. It's how we are supporting the mind and body to move through experiences that matters to whether we are going to actually embody that resilience or not. MFIT blends attention training skills through mindfulness practices with self-regulation exercises that I drew from some of the body-based trauma therapies that really focus on helping our survival brain to perceive safety, because it is our survival brain, the oldest parts of our brain, that both determine if we're turning stress on. It's that part of the brain that is assessing, something threatening or challenging. And it's that part of the brain that's assessing, are we helpless or powerless or lacking control? So it turns the stress or trauma on. But it's also that part of the brain that assesses when we feel safe. And if that part of the brain assesses safety, it automatically will turn on all of the recovery functions that our system automatically knows how to do. It's just how we're wired to do. So MFIT uses attention training and an understanding of how the mind and body work during stress and trauma so that we can learn how to direct our attention deliberately in ways that help the survival brain perceive safety so that the recovery can happen. And we do this gradually because for people who've experienced a lot of stress and trauma, their ability to pay attention to sensations in their body and to pay attention to emotions can have been wired in an imbalanced way. And it can actually sometimes paying attention to painful sensations or even sensations that wouldn't seem painful, like breathing, it can actually exacerbate stress. It can make the survival brain get flooded and re-traumatized. And I talk about why that happens scientifically in the book. And that was certainly my own first experience with mindfulness training. When I first started practicing, I was only practicing like 10 minutes a day, paying attention to the breath, because that's what everybody said you do. You pay attention to the breath. But for those of us who've experienced a lot of trauma, attending to breath sensations has the potential to tap into unresolved memory capsules from prior traumatic events. And it can then freak the survival brain out, and then we end up, very symptomatic. And that was my situation. I would practice, paying attention to the breathing, and I would slip into panic attacks. And then for days afterwards, I'd have insomnia, and I'd be agoraphobic. I couldn't leave the house, and I would have racing thoughts and my, pounding heart, and I had no idea what was going on. I was like, this is supposed to be making it better. Why is it making it worse? So MFIT really slows that process down, and it uses a very specific sequence of attentional targets so that the survival brain can slowly build up the capacity to attend inside the body without making it worse, and then to help the body recover. I know that was a long answer. I hope that made sense.
No, it was a pretty complete answer. So this, this isn't obviously a quick fix. People do have to practice. They have to learn. Has to be retrained. But what would happen, for example, in the beginning, before somebody's got to the point of developing these skills, where they're having a panic attack? Is there something, an intervention, that MFIT uses that could be helpful to get them into the place where they can be more receptive, more calm, and do the things they need to do to sort of power down that reaction?
Yes, that's a wonderful question, Sandie. There are two different attentional target objects that someone can use, even without having had a lot of training, that can help to interrupt that rapid cycling that's making it worse. The first one is to open attention very wide out to hearing or out to seeing what's around you, your present moment surroundings. So really focusing on listening to sounds in the environment, or focus on looking out and looking around and identifying what you're seeing in this present moment. So present moment sensory experience outside of the body, sights and sounds. That's the first thing that can help kind of interrupt that cycle of a panic attack or some other very, very intense thing from getting worse. And the other one is attending to where the body is in contact with things around it. So attending to the pressure and the hardness of the backs of the legs in the chair, or the bottoms of the feet of the floor. Or you could rub your hands up and down your legs and feel the texture on the palms of your hands of rubbing against, the clothing on your thighs. And these sensory experiences of contact, in MFIT we call them the contact points. Paying attention to the contact points is a wonderful attentional target to show the survival brain that we are safe, that we're grounded, that we're present, that we have support. And those are important things for the survival brain to be paying attention to when things get really out of control, because this is a very concrete sensory attention to grounding, and that helps the survival brain feel safe. And so that will help turn on the down regulation for recovery.
Yeah, but people in, the throes of a panic attack, do they have the presence of mind? I mean, I can see that this is something, that if I was with someone having a panic attack, I now know a bit more about what I can do to help them by drawing their attention to these things. But if they're on their own, how effective is it?
When someone has not done some of the basic training to help their system kind of know that this is a refuge, if they've never heard of it and they're really, really, really in the throes of a very intense panic attack, you're right. It's going to be very hard for them to be able to go in this direction without someone outside coaching them. And many of the best trauma therapists who work with some of the body-based techniques, this is what they do. They actually guide someone to pay attention in this way, and that person's system starts to downregulate. So it's not necessarily going to be super easy if someone hasn't been practicing. But that said, it doesn't need a whole lot of practice. The contact points exercise is a 5-minute exercise, and if someone's just doing that 5 minutes every day for a couple weeks, and then they have a panic attack, they are going to be able to use this to great effect. And for that reason, on my website, I have the guided audio instructions for the contact points exercise. Someone can join my mailing list, get that, and listen to it once a day for 2 weeks. By that point, their system will have internalized enough that it will know that this exists as a refuge, and they will be able to rely on it even when they're highly activated. But for someone who's in a panic attack, who's never heard any of this, who doesn't understand the science, the likelihood that their system is going to go here, like on its own, pretty low. Because when we are in a panic attack, most of us are going to be identifying with our racing thoughts. And as we pay attention to the racing thoughts, that actually, the survival brain perceives that as more threatening, and it's just going to amp the panic attack up. It's the reason why most people start panic attacks, it just seems to keep going, because where their attention gets drawn during the attack is making it worse.
Well, and I guess that's why you've created this this audio that people can download so that they can start their training as soon as they want, especially if they know they're prone to panic attacks. Yes.
And before the pandemic, thankfully, I had partnered with Sounds True, which is a company that does a lot of different courses in this space. And we created an online version of the MFIT course that's available on demand, the whole 8-week course. It's available on demand. It's self-paced. The content becomes available over an 8-week period, but many people choose to go more slowly with it. And the links to register for that are also on my website. And if any of your listeners are in some kind of public service role, medical workers or first responders or military or veterans or public school teachers, they can apply to get access to the course for free. And the explanation for that is on my website as well.
Cool. So, Widen the Window, you've said that, it grew out of the experimental research testing your program with troops preparing for combat. The book is not just for veterans and people working in high-stress environments, though, is it? I mean, it can help anybody.
Yes, we're all human. We all share this wiring. Many of the foundations and government organizations that give grants for projects like this are interested in high-stress populations, which is why one of the reasons why we worked with the military. But this works for anyone. And honestly, if you're living on the planet right now, through the pandemic, through the intense levels of uncertainty that we've been coping with as a planet, everyone is somewhat dysregulated right now, so this could benefit anybody who'd like to try it. And it does. We've had thousands and thousands of people in the online course. Very few of them are currently first responders or military, and yet in the monthly Zoom calls with participants, it's been clear it's been very helpful to most of them.
So one of the things that we're all aware of is how much the growth of technology has contributed to the amount of stress we're all feeling. I mean, what that alone, forget, many things it does, just the cognitive dissonance from having constant news feeds, dripping information, often contradictory information, every second. That alone can do things to the brain. I know that you're very interested in how the technology is affecting us and what we might be able to do about it. Would you like to say a few words about that?
Yes, Sandie. the interest in technology of mine actually predated all of this other work, and I'm going back to that now in my next project. As I was finishing up Widen the Window, I started doing some of the preliminary research looking at how our technology reliance has affected our social wiring, and it definitely has blunting effects. The research that exists to date suggests that when we are actively in contact with our technology, it blunts the best parts of our social wiring, which can then make the stress and emotion contagion much more likely. There's been, of course, all of the recent uncovering with the whistleblower at Facebook about the understandings of what's happened with Instagram and, the young women and the bad feelings and emotions that it creates. And the comparing mind that the technology on social media creates, the online bullying. There's so many different ways that it can affect us. And then, of course, we begin to develop cognitive habits in our reward circuits, where, that people get addicted to picking up the phone and having that small burst of dopamine as they read a text or look at an email or look at something on social media. So it's having big effects on some very basic aspects of our brain's wiring and our nervous system in ways that I think are leading all of us to have narrower windows as well. But on a more global way, or kind of at a more at the level of an organization or society, our reliance on technology tends to reinforce habits towards being very intolerant of uncertainty. And of course, uncertainty is a part of life. We don't know what's happening next. And sometimes with our technologies, we create this illusion that we do know what's going to happen next. It creates these illusions of certainty and illusions of control. And that can actually lead us to be leaning so far into the future, trying to anticipate what's going to happen and prevent the things that we don't want to happen from happening. We forget then how to fully be in the present. And then when something unwanted happens that we didn't want to happen, we can actually have even less capacity to respond and cope because we've been leaning so far out in the future. So I tend to think of technology as reinforcing this future-oriented anxiety management of, anticipating and trying to prevent the unwanted. But I think the last couple years on the planet, which have gone in ways that no one would have expected back in the middle of 2019, I think it's only reinforced how much we really, as a species, need to be reinforcing our capacity for present moment anxiety management, for our capacity for resilience, for being able to respond well no matter what happens, instead of leaning so far out in the future, trying to prevent something unwanted from happening. We have to have the capacity to be able to be present to whatever is happening and to manage it well.
Yeah. Well, it's as awful as the pandemic has been for so many people. There are some, gifts in there. And I think the fact that we have been confronted, face on with a lot of things gives us an opportunity to make a course correction.
I think that's right. And I think it's not a moment too soon when you think about the projections with climate change over the next 20 years. We need to develop a collective capacity to be able to respond to whatever's happening, because the things that are coming are not things that many people would prefer, and yet it is going to be happening. So we need to develop capacities to navigate it well.
Yeah, and we do have those capacities. As you say, we just need to develop them. Dr. Elizabeth Stanley, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm afraid we're out of time. I would like to have talked for more, but thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This hour went quickly, didn't it?
It did. Yeah, time flies, etc. Well, we've been discussing Dr. Stanley's latest book, Widen the Window, Training Your Brain and Body to Thrive During Stress and Recover from Trauma, which is published by Avery, a division of Penguin Books, and it's also available as an audiobook. As Dr. Stanley mentioned, she has partnered with Sounds True to create an online version of the MFIT course, which is freely available to anyone in a public service role. For more information about all of this, about the book and Dr. Stanley's work, visit her website, elizabeth-stanley.com. That brings us to the end of this week's show. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'll be back at the same time next week with another edition of What Is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me.